Well, good morning. This is the Lew Rockwell Show, and it's so great to have as our guest this morning Judge John V. Denson. Judge Denson's podcasts are some of the most popular that we have, and what he does is he talks about some of the books that he's just read or books he read in the past and is reevaluating, and they're always just tremendously interesting. And besides being a judge and an attorney, he's also an historian, a great man, a great learned man. And John, it's so great to have you here. And tell us about the first book that you're going to talk about today.
All right, it's good to be back, Lou. I always enjoy these podcasts with you. The book I'm going to talk about today is The First Founding Father. It's about Richard Henry Lee and written by Harlow Unger, who is a distinguished historian that has written some 11 biographies of American founders. The title, First Founding Father, Richard Henry Lee and the Call to Independence, was a little bit interesting to me because I'm a member of the Sons of American Revolution, and the name of our chapter is the Richard Henry Lee chapter. So when I joined, I really didn't know who he was, and I realized that now after reading this book, he's maybe the most important founder because he was the first founding father, and you'll see as we get into this how he is so important. And this author takes a position that he's been badly neglected in commemorating the history of the founding. Here's the opening paragraph of the book written by Mr. Unger, and he says,
John, your books always remind me of Murray Rothbard's because you have so many notes written on the pages of the book.
It runs it for resale because I talked to the author.
No, it doesn't hurt it at all. No.
Here's his introduction. He says, before Washington, before Jefferson, before Franklin, or John Adams, there was Lee, Richard Henry Lee. First of the founding fathers to call for independence, first to call for union, first to call for a Bill of Rights. Richard Henry Lee was as much a father of our country as George Washington, for it was Lee who masterminded the political and diplomatic victories that ensured Washington's military victory in the Revolutionary War. And after the nation took shape, it was Lee, not James Madison, who conceived the Bill of Rights that our nation enjoys today.
Wow.
That's a pretty good thing.
Mm-hmm.
He was the first to call for committees of correspondence. He was the first to call for drawing up the Articles of Confederation. He served as president of the Articles of Confederation legislature, which was it wasn't president of the United States, it was just the presiding officer for the Congress of the Articles of Confederation. But I'll start off with a little bit about the significance, why you call it first founding father, because he is the person that at the congressional meeting of the Continental Congress, he made the motion for independence. And it was a crucial time in American history because France had taken the position that, and they were being solicited by mainly Benjamin Franklin to help us. And they took the position, well, you're still negotiating with England. The fighting's going on. Are you going to be independent or not? So it was a sort of a position of fish or cut bait time. And unless America took a firm position of independence, they were not going to get the help from the French. So it was decided that they would have this motion made, and Lee was selected to be the person to make that motion. And let me tell you a little bit of background about why he was so important at that time and is today. His family came to America back in about 1640. And the first Lee came with a lot of people with him, and so he got head rights to about 1,000 people, so that gave him 50 acres for each person. But it was his father, Thomas Lee, that acquired the huge land ownership of the Lees. And he obviously had a good relationship with the King of England, Thomas, the father did, because he negotiated some treaties with the Indians, and the king gave him 500,000 acres of land, which was a pretty good gift, and it stretched all the way into what's now Ohio. And then he married a woman that brought in 50,000 more.
Wow.
Then he bought some more. So it was a big landed family. Thomas Lee was also educated in the best schools of England, and he made sure that his children were well educated. So he built a two-story building on his plantation, and they grew tobacco. That was their crop, wasn't cotton. He built this house and employed a retired Scottish minister and to come teach his children homeschooling. He had 6 sons and 2 daughters. And so the tutor took them at age 5, and they stayed with him until age 12. Then they were shipped off to boarding school in England, to the best boarding schools. And when they completed the boarding schools, they went to the best universities. So all of them were extremely well educated. They even studied John Locke in the homeschooling between ages 5 and 12, Second Treatise on Government. So Lee was extremely well educated, and after he graduated from college in England, he toured the continent and stayed a lot in Paris, and then in London he came back and stayed with his older brother. Of course, this was primogeniture, so he inherited. The older brother got most of the land, I think. Richard Henry got just a couple of 100 acres, so he had a small thing. But they also had a very profitable business with England, in that they planted the cotton, cured it, and they had an interest in ships, or maybe owned them. So there was no middleman that grew the tobacco, put it on their ships, and sent it to England. And 2 of the brothers lived in England. They received the cotton and sold it to retailers. So it was an extremely profitable business. So you got this landed gentry, well educated and very good contact with England. And then here's the man that's chosen to say, we need to separate. So that was the significance of having him make the motion. It was decided that they would see if anybody would second the motion. But as a backup, John Adams was there, and so he was going to make the second. And that would bring the North and the South together. So Lee wrote the resolution that was later part of it, was copied in the Declaration of Independence by Jefferson, but he wrote the resolution and then made the motion that we declare independence. And there was this long silence. Nobody seconded it for a long time. So finally, Adams made the second, and they started the discussions. So not taking a vote, just what do y'all think? So 5 states representatives said they were for independence. 5 states said they were against it. 3 states said that they didn't have or colonies said they didn't have the authority to take a position. So obviously they couldn't take a vote. So at that point, Lee took it on himself to campaign for independence. And his sister was married to a very prominent physician. They had a beautiful home. I don't know whether it was in Williamsburg or Philadelphia, but anyway, he started entertaining people at her home. And he was very articulate, very brilliant. In fact, later on, some of the newspapers called him the Cicero of the American Revolution. So he was a very convincing man. So they set up July 2 as the date to bring it to a vote. When they got there, the vote was 12-0. Georgia, I think. No, New York. Didn't take a position at first, but they later took the vote. So that July 2 was the date that they declared independence. So John Adams wrote his wife, and he said July the 2nd, 1776 is going to be the most important date in American history, and in the world maybe, where we've declared our independence from the British Empire. So Lee had already told him he couldn't stay longer because he had to get back to his business. So he was not present when they selected the committee to draw up the Declaration of Independence. But there's the famous picture of the presenting the Declaration of Independence with Jefferson there has Lee present in the audience, but he really wasn't. But he surely should have been on that committee. So Jefferson, as we know, was selected to write the Declaration. He used a lot of Lee's language in the Declaration. So we now celebrate July the 4th as the date of independence, but it's really July 2, so happy July 2nd to you. And so then Lee, after that, he was a member of the Continental Congress, and we were getting first in the war, He did take part in the war, especially defending Virginia, and actually fought in some of the battles. But he was mainly Washington's support with the Continental Congress, and seeing that Washington was always short of funds and people and very discouraged, and Lee was his main support in Congress. So we get now to the convention. So Lee is in the Continental Congress, and they authorize the meeting in Philadelphia in order to amend the Articles of Confederation, not to draw up a constitution. So Patrick Henry was selected as a delegate, and Lee was selected, Washington was selected. All three declined. Patrick Henry said he smelled a rat. He wasn't going to go. Lee said that he was already in the Continental Congress. Washington said that he sort of done all he could do. And Madison put the pressure on Washington, said, we can't do anything if you're not there. So George Mason and George Washington and Lee were all close personal friends. In fact, Washington and Lee met when they were about 22 years old, and they had gone in business together to develop the land called the Ohio Land Company. And then Mason was a close neighbor, as far as you can be close to somebody with hundreds of acres of land, to Washington. But Mason was a strong, as we call him, anti-federalist now, but very much for a federal government, meaning that you would have sovereignty of the states with not a strong central government. And the words federalist and anti-federalist got all messed up like the words liberal and conservative.
Creeps, yeah.
Yeah. So, liberal in the 19th century meant something different than it did in the 20th and so forth. So later they became known as the two competing sides as the Federalists, who really did not believe in federalism. They should have been called the Nationalists. And the Anti-Federalists believed in federalism. So anyway, we'll call them as they are in history. But Lee and Mason were both strong Anti-Federalists. And the main thing that Lee talked with Mason about before the Constitutional Convention was be sure that you add the Bill of Rights to the Articles of Confederation. It's a little bit confusing to me after reading the book about whose Bill of Rights we're talking about, because on my wall at my law office I have the Virginia Bill of Rights showing George Mason as the author. And I've always thought that George Mason was the author of the Bill of Rights that we have now, but according to this book, the Bill of Rights that we have are really composed by Lee. So Lee was encouraging Mason, be sure you have the Bill of Rights. So I think there were 70 delegates chosen, 55 showed up, 39 remained, and 36 signed, and 3 refused to sign, George Mason being one, Elbridge Gerry one, and Virginia Governor one. So they refused to sign the Constitution, mainly because it did not have a Bill of Rights. So right at the end of the Constitutional Convention, Mason and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts took the role of making a motion and a second that we add a Bill of Rights. And that vote was taken, and it was unanimously voted not to have a Bill of Rights. So James Madison voted not to add a Bill of Rights. And most of the states had copied George Mason's Bill of Rights, and so it wouldn't have been very difficult to have a Bill of Rights right quick. And but anyway, it was voted down. So the Constitution was then submitted to the states for ratification, take it or leave it. There was something like 100 or over 120 amendments proposed, and most all of them said you need to have a Bill of Rights. So it was a very close vote in a lot of places, and some of the states took the position that if you don't put a Bill of Rights, we're withdrawing our ratification. And, of course, Virginia and 2 other states specifically reserved the right to secede if they didn't have the Bill of Rights and so forth. So Lee, as you can imagine, was extremely upset that they didn't amend the Articles of Confederation and drew up a Constitution, which he said, even with a Bill of Rights, is too strong. We've gone from one extreme to the other. and he was especially upset with no Bill of Rights. So he and George Mason were very much against the ratification in Virginia. And that broke up the friendship they had with Washington. He was upset that his good friends were opposing the Constitution that he had presided over. And that friendship with Washington didn't get renewed till right near the end of Lee's life. He had opposed a lot of the Constitution. Lee had opposed a lot of the Constitution because the president had too much power, and especially in issuing executive orders. And Washington issued an executive order while he was president for neutrality. And so Lee made an exception and commended him for his neutrality stance. And that helped George Washington because Lee had always opposed those executive orders. But anyway, Patrick Henry just apparently had a hatred for James Madison. And he wanted to make sure that the legislature did not have James Madison as one of the senators. So Patrick Henry pretty much controlled the legislature. And so he had Lee as one of the U.S. senators, and another strong anti-federalist as the other senator. And so Madison was still for the Constitution without a Bill of Rights. But he took the position, Madison took the position that I'm going to run for Congress. And my pledge to you is if you elect me to Congress, the first thing I'm going to do is submit a Bill of Rights. And that helped get the vote passed. And it took 9 states to approve the Constitution. At the time they were voting, they were the 9th state. They didn't know it, but New Hampshire had already voted for it. So, but it was a crucial thing. Are we going to have a nation or not? And New York had not voted at that point either. But anyway, it was a close vote, but they approved it. But it appears that when Madison got to Congress, that he kept the promise of working with Lee, and apparently the main verbiage of the Bill of Rights was composed by Lee and not Madison. And so I think Madison finally submitted something like 17 Bill of Rights, and the Congress adopted 12 and sent them to the states, and so we have the 10. And Lee was very upset with the 10th Amendment leaving out the word expressly. And the 10th Amendment was supposed to read, all those rights belong to the states except those which are expressly delegated under the Constitution to the federal government. Of course, the express delegation in the Constitution gave Congress the right to coin money. And Hamilton later took advantage of leaving expressly out and said, well, if it's not expressly given, it's implied, because you need a bank to coin money, and it's necessary and proper. And, of course, Lee objected to the necessary and proper clause, which has become the elastic clause in constitutional law. But anyway, Lee stayed active as long as he could. He died at age 62 in 1794. He didn't finish his term in the Senate due to health reasons. And I want to close up on the history of all this with what happened after James Madison was president. As we know, he sort of switched over with Jefferson as they created the Democrat-Republican Party, and Jefferson became president, and Madison Secretary of State, and so forth. So Madison decided, after the war, after he was his term as president ended, that he was going to write a history of the secret meetings and what happened at the Constitutional Convention, because they were all sworn to secrecy. They wouldn't let anybody in. Nobody knew what was said there. So Madison, in 1816 or 17 is when his term ended. In 1819, his notes came out. Well, there were still 2 delegates that had opposed Madison throughout the convention. They were from New York. And the other delegate from New York was Hamilton, who was the arch nationalist. Yates was one of the New York delegates. He'd been elected to the Supreme Court of New York, and I think he had died. Well, he had made extensive notes at the convention. So Lansing decided to reply to Jefferson. And the book that was written in 1821 with Yates' notes, and this was the first time that people had known what Hamilton had done at the Constitutional Convention. Yates and Lansing got so upset with Hamilton they left before it was over. But when Hamilton got up to speak at the Constitutional Convention, which is stated in this book now, they disclose it, he said the greatest government in the world is the British Empire, the British government. And we need to get as close as we can to that model without having a king. And so we need for the president to be elected for life. And we need the U.S. senators to be elected for life, and like the Tories. And then we need the states to just be administrative bodies, not have sovereignty, and have governors appointed by the president. And so it was the most extreme national government that you could imagine. I imagine that Madison probably didn't go along with that. They said when Hamilton got through, there was this long silence, and nobody said anything for it or against it. They just sort of startled and just went on to other business. But anyway, Hamilton ended up being there by himself and signing for the Constitution, and Lansing and Yates left and went back to New York. New York's governor, Clinton, was very strong anti-federalist against the Constitution. So by the time New York voted, 9 states had already approved it. But the way the Federalist Papers got started was mainly by Hamilton, wrote most of it, Madison about a third of it, and Jay about 5 of the essays. But it was mainly propaganda for New York to approve the Constitution. And by naming themselves the Federalists, it confused people thinking that they were for federalism. So the thing that I learned in this new book is that finally it settles who wrote the best anti-federalist papers was Lee. He wrote what was called the Letters of a Federal Farmer. And I've read histories from years back where people speculated Melancton Smith wrote them, and nobody knew who wrote it. But now this professor that wrote this book on Lee says it's now absolutely clear that those were the essays of Lee that were the best written. And that's why he was known as being so articulate and well-educated, and those were the best things that they had. But the Anti-Federalists had a big disadvantage. They didn't have an alternate document they could say to the states, look, this is better than what's been presented. You had to pick and choose. And Lee's writings were probably too erudite for most people to absorb them and so forth. So today, when you see people say, if you want to know what the Constitution is, read the Federalist. And it's, of course, the propaganda paper for strong national government. But
just political pamphlets.
Yeah.
Lying political pamphlets.
I brought this medal here to show you. I can't show it to the people listening. But after the American Revolution, Benjamin Franklin designed a medallion to commemorate the help that France gave, and this book goes into a good bit of the war and the fact that France was the key to us winning the American Revolution. So this shows the Lady of Liberty fighting the English Lion, and then at the bottom is a baby, which is the United States, and on the other side, the Lady of Liberty and the Liberty cap. And this was for the bicentennial of America. So they reproduced this, and it's an exact copy of what was done back after the Revolution. So the book pays great tribute to the French for helping us out and helping us win, but it shows Lee as the first founding father is maybe one of the most important men of the whole American Revolution. It's a shame that he hadn't been recognized before now, and he certainly should be. So this is a good book. It's a fairly new book. I recommend it strongly.
Well, John, tremendous, and we, of course, will link to this book, as we'll link to your books. I think everybody can, who's maybe not heard John before, understand why he was a great teacher as well as everything else that he's achieved in his life. So, John, thanks a million, and come back soon, please.
Okay. It's always good to be here, Lew. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the LRC front page. Thank you.